The galaxy was full of wonders, but it was also full of dark places where cruelty thrived. On a distant planet, in a city filled with towering buildings and narrow streets, an auction was being held. It wasn't the kind of auction you might think of. This one sold lives. Alien slaves from all corners of the universe were put up for sale to the highest bidder. For most, it was the end of their freedom. For a 19-year-old alien girl, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The girl stood nervously on the stage, her hands bound behind her back. She was tall, with pale blue skin and long silver hair that flowed like water. Her eyes, large and dark, were filled with fear, but also something else, something that could only be seen by those who had lived through the worst of what the galaxy had to offer, a flicker of hope. She didn't know why she was being sold, only that her family had been taken by the warlords, and now she was here. The cold hands of fate had brought her to this cruel place. Her name was Lyra, when she had been taken from her home when she was just a child. Her people, the Zalari, were peaceful and kind, living far away from the battles and wars of the galaxy. But the greedy warlords didn't care for peace. They wanted power, and for that they needed slaves. Lyra had been raised in captivity. Her every move watched by the lords who owned her, trained to serve without question. The room was filled with a mix of alien species. All of them gathered to bid on Lyra and others like her. They didn't care who she was or where she came from. To them, she was just an object to be bought and sold. Her heart pounded in her chest as the auctioneer called out in a loud voice. Next up, we have a rare specimen, a 19-year-old Zalari. Slave, untouched, and pure. She has been trained for service and obedience, ready to serve in any capacity you desire. Start the bidding at 500,000 credits. A murmur ran through the crowd as the bids began. Lyra's eyes fell to the floor, unable to look at the people who were choosing her fate. She didn't know what would happen to her after this. She had heard rumors of other slaves being treated as nothing more than tools, some used for labor, others for more personal purposes. The thought made her sick, but there was nothing she could do. She was just one girl, one slave, in a galaxy full of them. The bids continued to rise higher, but Lyra couldn't focus on the numbers. She only heard the voices, the laughter, the coldness in their words. Her mind began to race as she thought about what would happen next. Who would buy her? What would they want from her? And then, just as she was about to lose hope, she heard a voice from the back of the room. It was different from the others, calm and steady. It was human. "Take her," the voice said. Lyra's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the voice. Standing at the back of the room was a man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple black uniform that marked him as a soldier. His eyes were a deep brown, filled with something Lyra hadn't seen in a long time: compassion.
I'll lay there.
Was no greed in his gaze, no desire to own her. There was only a look of determination. The auctioneer hesitated for a moment, clearly surprised by the unexpected bid. "You wish to buy her?" he asked, his voice cold. The man stepped forward, his face serious. "Yes, I do." The crowd fell silent. Lyra's heart beat faster. Who was this man? Why had he spoken up when no one else had? The auctioneer finally nodded, his voice smooth. "Very well. The bid stands at 750,000 credits. Do you accept?" The man didn't hesitate. "I'll pay it," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. Lyra couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had been sold, yes, but not to someone who looked at her like a possession. This man was different. He was offering to pay a large sum. For her, an amount that could change her life. But more than that, he had looked at her as if she were a person, not an object. The auctioneer waved his hand, signaling the transaction was complete. "Sold," he announced, and the room erupted into whispers. The man who had bid for her stepped forward, his gaze meeting Lyra's. She looked at him with wide eyes, unsure of what to expect. "Come with me," the man said gently. He reached out a hand to her, but Lyra hesitated. She had spent her whole life being told what to do, told who to trust. But something in this man's eyes made her believe in something she had long forgotten. Hope. Lyra took a step forward, then another, until she was standing beside him. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. "You're free now." For the first time in years, Lyra believed him. And for the first time in her life, she had a choice. The cold night air brushed against Lyra's skin as she stepped out of the auction house. The human soldier stood beside her, his strong presence offering an unexpected sense of safety. She was free now, but the weight of her past still clung to her. She had been torn away from her home, sold like an object, and her mind struggled to process the sudden change in her life. The soldier led her through the dark streets, avoiding the crowded areas where people still discussed the auction. As they walked, Lyra stayed silent, trying to gather her thoughts. She had no idea who this man was or why he had bought her, but something inside her told her to trust him. It wasn't easy. Trust had been a scarce thing for so long, but there was kindness in his eyes. Something she hadn't seen in a long time. The soldier didn't speak either. He kept his pace steady, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if he were expecting danger at any moment. Lyra couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice in following him. Would he take her somewhere safe? Or was he just another buyer like all the others? Finally, they reached a small, quiet alleyway where a sleek silver ship was parked. The soldier stopped in front of it and turned to her. "You'll be safe here," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something in it, a promise. Lyra looked up at the ship. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. The design was smooth and modern, with glowing blue lights along its sides that gave it an almost otherworldly feel. She had seen ships like this before, but only from a distance. The idea that she might now be inside one was almost too surreal to grasp. Before she could respond, the soldier led her inside the ship. The interior was sleek and polished, with soft lighting and comfortable seats. It felt nothing like the dark, cold cages of the auction house. This place smelled clean, like fresh air and freedom. Lyra's heart began to race as she realized that she was no longer trapped. The soldier showed her to a small room at the back of the ship. It was cozy, with a bed, a desk, and a large window that offered a view of the stars outside. Lyra hesitated. Before entering, feeling the weight of her past pressing down on her shoulders. She had spent so long as a slave, being told where to sleep and what to do. This was new. This was different. The soldier turned to her, his expression softening. "You can stay here as long as you need. This is your space. No one will tell you what to do anymore." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a promise. Lyra nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" The soldier sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "I don't like seeing people suffer. I've seen enough cruelty in this galaxy, and I can't turn away when I see someone who needs help." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Lyra simply stared at him, unsure of how to react. He was different from anyone she had ever met. Most people had seen her as nothing more than a tool, a thing to be used. But this man, he saw her as a person. "Don't know what to do now," Lyra admitted, her voice shaky. "I've never been free before. I don't know how to live like this." The soldier gave her a small, understanding smile. "It's okay. You don't have to figure everything out right away. Just take it one step at a time." Lyra nodded, though she still felt lost. The soldier walked over to the desk and picked up a small device. He handed it to her. "This is a communicator," he explained. "If you ever need anything, you can reach me through this. I'll be close by." Lyra took the device, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had someone who cared. She looked up at him, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. The soldier nodded. "It's the least I can do." With that, he turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He glanced back at her, his eyes soft. "You're not alone anymore," he said, before disappearing into the hallway. Lyra sat down on the bed, the weight of everything that had happened slowly sinking in. She could hardly believe that she was free. The stars outside the window seemed to shine brighter now, as if they were telling her that there was hope. But even in her relief, there was a part of her that still felt lost. What was she supposed to do now? How was she supposed to live? In a world where she had no control, no family, and no idea where to go next? But she had time. The soldier had given her time. She didn't have to figure everything out in one night. She could breathe. She could rest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a slave. She was a person with a future, whatever that future might hold. The days following Lyra's escape were quiet, but they were filled with uncertainty. She spent her time adjusting to her new life aboard the soldier's ship, but it wasn't easy. The memories of the auction, the cold eyes of the buyers, and the hands that had bound her still haunted her. She had never experienced freedom before, and now that it was hers, she wasn't sure what to do with it. The soldier, whose name she had learned was Captain Luke, was kind to her, but he kept his distance. He gave her space to settle in, respecting her need for silence. But she noticed how often he stared out the window, deep in thought. She knew. He was a man of action, someone who had seen battles and hardship. But she couldn't help but wonder if he was haunted by his own past. One evening, as the stars sparkled outside the ship's windows, Luke called Lyra to the cockpit. She had become familiar with the ship's interior, but the cockpit was a place she had avoided. It was where the real work of flying the ship happened. Lyra wasn't sure why she was being called there, but she felt a nervous flutter in her stomach as she walked down the narrow corridor. When she entered the cockpit, she found Luke standing near a large console. He turned to her as she stepped in, his face serious. "Lyra," he said, his voice low. "I need your help." Lyra blinked, unsure of what he meant. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Luke motioned away. Screen displaying a map of several planets. "I've been tracking the slave trade. The man who bought Youth, the one who ran the auction, isn't just some rich lord. He's part of a bigger network. They've been operating across several systems, taking people like you and selling them off." Lyra felt a shiver run through her. The thought of those like her being trapped in the same situation she had been in made her stomach turn. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke's gaze hardened. "I'm going to stop them, but I need to find out where they are keeping their slaves. I've got a contact in a nearby system, someone who has information on their operations. I'm planning to infiltrate their base and get the slaves out. But I can't do it alone. I need you." Lyra's heart raced. "I don't know if I can help," she said, shaking her head. "I've never been in a fight. I don't know how to do what you do." Luke stepped closer to her, his eyes gentle but firm. "You don't need to fight, Lyra. What I need from you is information. I need you to help me get inside their base. You're the one who knows how they operate. You've seen how they work. You can guide me to where they keep the slaves." Lyra's mind swirled with doubt. She didn't feel like she knew anything useful. All she had ever done was obey orders, never question them. How could she help someone like Luke, who had been trained for missions, for battle? But then she thought about the people still out there, slaves like her, trapped in cages with no hope. If she didn't help, who would? "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice more confident than she felt. "I'll help you." Luke gave her a small smile. "I knew I could count on you, but we'll need to be careful. This is going to be dangerous. We'll be going up against some powerful people, and they won't hesitate to hurt us if we're caught. Note. But if we can get the information we need, we can stop them." The next few days were filled with preparation. Luke showed Lyra how to use the ship's systems and how to communicate with his contact, a former slave who had escaped years ago and now worked as an informant. Lyra wasn't sure if she was ready for what was to come. She couldn't stand the thought of sitting by while others suffered. She was no longer a slave, and she wouldn't let anyone else be one either. Luke kept things quiet, moving cautiously through the galaxy. He knew they had to be careful, as the people they were going after had connections everywhere. They stopped at small remote planets to refuel and gather supplies. Each time they landed, Lyra felt more at ease. She was learning about the universe, about the places beyond the auction house, beyond the life she had once known. For the first time, she was in control of her own fate. One evening, as the ship coasted through the quiet of space, Luke sat down beside Lyra in the common room. He looked at her, his expression serious. "You've been through a lot, Lyra," he said softly. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to, and keep moving, keep running. But if we go forward with this, there's no turning back." Lyra looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. She had never known what it was like to have choices, to have the power to change her life. But now, for the first time, she had that power. She couldn't waste it. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. Luke nodded. "Then let's do this." The plan was set. We're going to infiltrate the slave base, free those still trapped, and put an end to the ruthless people who had stolen so many lives. Lyra felt something stir inside her, a spark of courage she never knew she had. The path ahead was dangerous, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to fight for the freedom of others. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready to fight for her own freedom as well. The ship glided through. The stars, silent and steady. Lyra stood by the large window, gazing out at the vast emptiness of space. She had been quiet for days, lost in her thoughts. The reality of what they were about to do was starting to settle in. She had never been involved in something like this. Before the auction house, the life she had been forced into seemed so far away now. But the mission ahead was no less dangerous. The soldier, Luke, had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He had studied every detail of the slave base they were going to infiltrate. They had gathered all the necessary tools and made contact with his informant, who had provided them with valuable information about the layout of the base and the security measures. Lyra's heart raced as she thought about the risks. They were about to enter the heart of an operation that had enslaved hundreds, maybe thousands, of people. Luke came into the room, his expression as serious as ever. "We're almost there." "It's time," he said, his voice low and focused. Lyra nodded, her throat dry. "What should I do?" Luke placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle. "You've done everything you can. Stick close to me, follow my lead, and we'll get through this. We're not here to fight. We're here to free those who are trapped. No one gets left behind." Lyra swallowed, nodding again. She wasn't sure if she believed it, but she trusted Luke. He had kept his word so far, and she knew he wouldn't let her down now. The thought of the people still stuck in chains, the ones who needed help, just like she had gave her strength, they approached the planet where the base was located. It was a barren, dusty world with little more than an old mining facility and a few scattered buildings. The slave base was hidden beneath the surface in a complex of tunnels and underground rooms. It was built to be hidden, to keep the slaves out of sight from the outside world. Lyra shivered at the thought of being trapped down there. The ship landed in a small, secluded area far from the base's main entrance. Luke powered down the engines and turned to Lyra. "Stay close. We'll move quickly," he said, his eyes sharp with determination. Lyra nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what would happen once they were inside, but she was ready. Ready to do whatever it took to make sure no one else had to suffer like she had. They suited up in black gear, designed to help them blend into the shadows. Luke's movements were swift and practiced, and Lyra tried to match his pace. Her hands were shaking as she put on her helmet, the tight-fitting material making her feel like someone else. Someone who was capable of doing something important. They made their way to the entrance of the base, a narrow door hidden behind rocks and rusted metal. Luke motioned for Lyra to wait as he approached the door, checking the security panel. After a few tense moments, the door clicked open. They slipped inside, into the dark, cold hallways of the base. The air was musty, and the only sound was the soft hum of machinery in the distance. Luke led the way, his movements precise as he navigated the labyrinth of corridors. Lyra followed closely, trying to stay as quiet as possible. She had no idea how long they had before someone would notice. They were there. "We're looking for the hold area," Luke whispered. "That's where they keep the slaves. Once we're in, we'll get them out. We won't be in here long." Lyra could feel her heart racing, her breath shallow as they moved deeper into the complex. She wasn't sure how she had gotten here, how she had gone from being a slave to being part of something that could change everything. She had no experience with covert missions, no knowledge of how to fight. But she had learned to be quiet, to move when told, and to keep her head down. She hoped those skills would be enough. They reached a heavy door at the end of one hallway. Luke paused, listening for any sound on the other side. When he didn't hear anything, he pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. Empty. He muttered, "Let's move." They slipped through the door and into a dimly lit room filled with rows of cages. The slaves were huddled inside, some sitting on the floor, others pacing nervously. Most of them looked exhausted, their faces hollow from years of being trapped. Lyra's stomach twisted as she saw the same fear and sadness in their eyes that she had once felt. Luke moved quickly, pulling out a small device to disable the lock on each cage. The slaves inside looked up, their eyes wide in confusion and fear. Lyra could see the hope flickering in their eyes, but it was quickly replaced by doubt. They had been told so many times that rescue wasn't possible, that they were stuck here. Forever. "Stay quiet," Luke whispered as he opened the last cage. "We're getting you out of here." Lyra stepped forward, looking at the terrified faces of the slaves. She wasn't just here for herself anymore. She was here to help them. To show them that freedom was still possible even if it seemed far away. She met their eyes, offering a quiet smile as Luke led the way out. They moved quickly through the corridors, their footsteps echoing off the cold walls. But as they approached the exit, the sound of footsteps behind them froze Lyra's blood. Someone was coming. "Run!" Luke shouted. They darted toward the nearest exit. The chase had begun. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the dark corridors as Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She and Luke had just freed the slaves, but now they were running for their lives. The small group of freed captives followed behind them, some struggling to keep up while others were too scared to speak. The excitement of being free was quickly overshadowed by the looming threat of being caught. Luke's face was set in determination, but Lyra could see the concern in his eyes. They had to move fast, but the halls seemed to stretch on forever, each corner leading to more dangers. The soldiers guarding the base had been trained to respond quickly. It wouldn't be long before they figured out that the prisoners were gone. "Keep moving," Luke ordered as he glanced over his shoulder. "We're almost there." Lyra's legs ached as she ran, her mind racing with thoughts of the others, the slaves who had been locked up just like she had been. She couldn't believe they were actually free. The doors to the outside were within reach, but the sound of a loud alarm echoed through the halls, signaling that they were discovered. "Go, go, go," Luke urged, pushing the group forward. The tension in the air was thick as they turned the corner and saw the exit up ahead. The base's security was tighter than they had anticipated. Luke had hoped they would get out undetected, but now the chase was on. Lyra could hear the clattering of boots against the floor, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the soldiers rushing toward them. "Not much farther," Luke shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Lyra's legs burned, but she pushed herself harder, desperate to reach the exit. She could hear the soldiers behind them, their voices shouting orders. They were closing in fast. She reached for the communicator Luke had given her earlier and pressed it to her ear, hoping for a sign of the rebels who had promised to help. "This is the plan," she whispered, almost to herself. "We have to make it out alive. We can't go back. Not now." They reached the large doors at the end of the hall, and Luke slammed his hand against the panel to unlock them. But before he could open them fully, a burst of gunfire rang out, narrowly missing them. Lyra ducked, instinctively pulling herself behind a metal column for cover. She felt a wave of panic wash over her as she heard the soldiers' voices getting closer. "We're not going to make it," one of the freed slaves cried, looking around in fear. "Stay calm," Luke ordered, his voice calm despite the situation. "We just need to get through these doors. Keep moving." As she took a deep breath, she could hear the soldiers closing in behind them. The doors were only halfway open, and time was running out. But then, she heard a familiar voice crackling through the communicator. "Luke, do you copy?" Lyra almost couldn't believe it. It was the rebel contact, the one who had given them the information. They had come through. "Lyra, are you there?" The voice continued. "We've got your back. We've disabled the security in the area. You've got 30 seconds to get out before the rest of their forces arrive." "Thank you," Lyra whispered into the communicator, relief flooding her veins. "Go," Luke shouted, stepping forward and pushing the doors the rest of the way open. The group rushed through the door, into the cold night air, their eyes blinking against the sudden brightness of the outside world. They were free, but they weren't safe yet. The soldiers would be on their heels in no time. Luke led the group through a narrow alley, moving quickly, pushing past anything that might slow them down. The sound of running footsteps followed them, but the rebels were helping them. The chase was far from over, but at least they had a chance. Over there, Luke pointed to a small building in the distance. It looked abandoned, tucked away from the main roads, hidden from the guards who would be looking for them. Make for cover, stay low. The group hurried toward the building, moving as quietly as possible. The soldiers were still after them, but the rebels had cut off their main routes. The ship that had come to their aid was parked nearby, waiting to take them out of the area. They just needed to make it to safety as they reached the building. Lyra's legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The adrenaline from the escape was still coursing through her body, but she couldn't keep up the pace any longer. She looked up to see Luke kneeling beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "We're almost there," he said, pulling her to her feet just a little more. He stumbled to the waiting ship, and the rebels who had been stationed there rushed to meet them. The pilot was already in the cockpit, ready to take off. "Get on board," the pilot called. "We're running out of time?" Lyra climbed aboard, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders as the door closed behind them. Luke followed, and as the ship started to rise, she looked out the window. The slave base was now just a distant dot on the planet's surface, but the sound of gunfire was still echoing in her ears. They were safe for now, but Lyra knew this was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be filled with more dangers, more risks. But for the first time in her life, she had a real chance at freedom. She wasn't just running from something anymore. She was running toward a future she never thought was possible. The ship sped through the quiet stretches of space, leaving the slave base behind. Lyra leaned back in her seat, exhausted, her body aching from the escape. She glanced around the small cockpit, seeing the faces of the freed slaves, all of them still processing what had just happened. Some were quietly talking to each other, while others simply stared out the window, lost in thought. The whole ship felt like a strange new world to them. Luke, sitting in the pilot's seat, was focused on navigating their path, but Lyra noticed the tension in his posture. He was always on alert. He had been the one leading the charge, the one who had kept them all safe, but she knew he was carrying a heavy burden. Even after all they had accomplished, they weren't out of danger. They still had to figure out what to do next. "We've got to keep moving," Luke said, his voice steady but full of determination. "The slave network is vast, and we can't stay in one place too long. They'll track us down if we do." Lyra nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She had been a slave for so long, she hadn't been able to fully understand how big the system of slavery was. Now that she had seen it firsthand, she realized that freeing a few people wouldn't be enough. There were still so many more out there, trapped just like she had been. Luke turned to her, noticing her worried expression. "You okay?" Lyra gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes, just thinking, there are so many more out there. People like me, like us. He nodded, his gaze hardening. "We can't stop now. This is bigger than any of us." The rebels had helped them escape, but there were still so many hurdles ahead. The network was dangerous, and their enemies weren't going to give up easily. The soldiers they had just escaped from would be just the beginning. There were others who would come after them, stronger, more prepared. Luke knew this, and though he tried to keep a calm face, Lyra could see that he was already making plans for their next move. "What now?" Lyra asked, breaking the silence that had settled over the ship. Luke took a deep breath, thinking, "We need to find a safe place to lay low. We'll contact our allies and see if they can help us set up something bigger. I have a few places in mind, but we need to make sure we're not being followed." Lyra glanced at the other slaves. They were all still adjusting to their newfound freedom. Some of them were scared, others were still processing the change. For so long, they had been told what to do, when to eat, when to sleep, and now they were free. But that freedom came with its own set of challenges. She approached one of the women who had been freed with her. The woman was older, with dark brown skin and a tired, worn face. She was sitting quietly, looking out the window. After all, These years, I thought I'd die in that place. Lyra nodded, understanding more than she could say. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? The woman looked at Lyra, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. What happens now? What do we do with all this freedom? Lyra thought for a moment. She didn't have the answers. She wasn't even sure where to go, but she did know one thing. She wasn't going to let this be the end of their story. She wasn't going to let them all fade into the background just because they had escaped one prison. They deserved better. We move forward, Lyra said, her voice filled with determination. We find a place where we can be safe, and we fight to make sure no one else has to suffer the way we did. The older woman nodded, a small but hopeful smile forming on her lips. I think I can get behind that. Meanwhile, Luke was still at the controls, keeping an eye on their surroundings. We're heading to a safe zone, he called over his shoulder. It's a remote area, but we should be able to rest there for a while. Lyra nodded, standing up and walking over to the window. She watched the stars streak past them, the vastness of space reminding her just how small they all were. It was strange to think of the universe as a place of endless possibilities. She had been trapped in a cage for so long that she hadn't realized how much there was to see. She could go anywhere now, do anything. She turned to look at the others, at the people she had helped save. They were still unsure, still learning to trust in their freedom. But there was something in their eyes now that hadn't been there before. Hope. Hope that there was a life beyond the one they had known. Luke stood up from the controls and walked over to Lyra. We'll get there soon, he said, offering a reassuring smile. Lyra returned the smile, but it was still hard to shake the feeling that they were being watched. She couldn't shake the fear that the people they had escaped from would come for them. They wouldn't stop, and neither could she. We will be safe, Lyra said quietly, her voice firm. We have to believe that. Luke didn't answer right away, but she could see the resolve in his eyes. He nodded, knowing that they couldn't stop Nonot when there was so much at stake. They were on the run, but they were not alone anymore. They had each other, and for the first time in Lyra's life, that was enough. The journey had been long and difficult, but after weeks of running, Luke and the freed slaves had finally found a temporary place to rest. It wasn't much, just a small settlement on a quiet, uninhabited planet, but it was a safe haven, at least for the time being. The ship had landed on the outskirts of a small forest, surrounded by mountains that shielded them from the prying eyes of the galaxy's most powerful enemies. Lyra stood by the window of the small cabin, watching the sun rise over the distant peaks. The light was soft, casting a gentle glow over the landscape. For the first time in her life, the sight of something so simple, so peaceful, felt almost too good to be true. She had been running from her past for so long, but now she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, her future was waiting for her here. The others were already waking up, slowly adjusting to their new reality. Some of the former slaves were still overwhelmed by the change. Many of them had lived their entire lives under the rule of cruel masters, and it would take time to heal. Lyra understood that better than anyone, but even in the quiet moments, she could see the change in them. They were starting to smile, to talk to each other. They were beginning to believe in the possibility of a life beyond the cages. Luke entered the cabin, his expression thoughtful. Morning, he said, his voice low. How are you holding up? Lyra turned to him, offering a soft smile. I'm good. It's hard to believe this is real, Luke nodded, stepping toward the table, where they had gathered to plan their next steps. We can't stay here forever. The threat is still out there, but we've got time. For now, we need to focus on what comes next. Lyra joined him at the table, sitting down across from him. What do we do now? We've freed ourselves, but I feel like we should be doing more. Luke's eyes softened as he looked at her. That's what I've been thinking, but we need to be careful. People we're up against aren't just going to disappear. They've resources, power. They'll keep coming after us unless we stop them. Lyra's hands clenched into fists. On the table, she couldn't stand the thought of the people who had hurt her and the others going unpunished. But Luke was right. They couldn't act recklessly. They needed a plan. I've been thinking about that too, Lyra said, her voice filled with determination. Maybe we can't stop everything at once, but we can start somewhere. We can help other slaves, free more people. We can be the spark that starts something bigger. Luke raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by her words. You're right, he said. We're not alone in this. There are more like us out there, people who want to fight for their freedom. We'll find them. We'll work together. Lyra looked at the small group of former slaves who were gathered in the other room, chatting quietly. They were still adjusting, still learning to trust each other, but they were beginning to form bonds. It was a small group, but it was a start. Maybe we can train them, Lyra suggested. Teach them how to fight back, how to protect themselves. They've been through so much, but they're stronger than they think. Luke nodded again, his eyes reflecting the weight of what they were about to take on. We'll need to teach them how to survive, how to defend themselves. But it's a good plan, and we're not doing it alone. We have the rebels. We have allies. Lyra felt a surge of hope. They weren't alone. They had people who were willing to stand with them, who believed in their cause. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been trapped in the same nightmare. As the day wore on, Lyra and Luke began to put their plan into motion. They gathered the former slaves and spoke with them, explaining what had happened and what they needed to do next. Some were scared, unsure of the future, but many were eager to fight for the life they had been denied. They were ready for change. The first step was simple: training. Luke and the rebels would teach them how to protect themselves, how to survive in a galaxy that could be just as dangerous as the one they had escaped from. Lyra didn't know much about combat, but she was determined to learn. She wanted to help, to be a part of something bigger than herself. The days turned into weeks as they prepared for what lay ahead. They worked together, each person contributing in their own way. Some of the former slaves proved to be quick learners, picking up weapons and self-defense techniques faster than Lyra expected. Others struggled, but Lyra could see the strength in them. They were all survivors, each one with a story to tell, each one with a burning desire for freedom, and slowly, bit by bit, they became a team one evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the forest, Lyra stood outside. Watching the stars begin to appear in the sky, she had never seen the night from this perspective before. For so long, the stars had been a distant, unreachable dream. But now, they were a symbol of hope. We're ready, Lyra said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. We're ready to fight. Luke stood beside her, his face calm but resolute. We'll do whatever it takes. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra felt the weight of her past begin to lift. She was no longer a slave. She was no longer someone who had to run. She was a fighter, and she was ready to take on the galaxy,